Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I am delighted to welcome you to this, the first of our fellows' presentations during this fall 2023 semester. I'm also welcoming you to the first of two Richard C. Holbrooke lectures this term. This one is entitled More Bark Than Bite, Right-Wing Politics and Foreign Policy, and will be delivered momentarily by Professor Andrew Moravcsik. Let me just first say something about this lecture. It is part of the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum, which was established in 2013 to honor the memory of the Academy founder and his lifelong commitment to applying the tools of diplomacy and statecraft to solving some of the world's most intractable problems. The program aims to bring together some of the most influential thinkers and practitioners in global affairs to engage in open and incisive discussion about pressing contemporary issues facing the international community. In 2018, the Holbrooke Fellowship was inaugurated, including both a residential fellowship at the Academy, as well as a workshop with leaders from government, business, and academia to discuss the respective fellows' research from various perspectives. And I really want to give a heartfelt thanks to all the donors who made the Holbrooke Forum possible, and in particular this fellowship possible. As something of an innovation this semester, we have, in point of fact, not one, but two Holbrooke Fellows for the first time, as Andy is ably joined by his fellow Holbrooke Fellow, who just happens to be his wife, Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie's lecture is scheduled for October, and that will give her some time to learn from Andy's experience. And for all of you who have been asking Andy if he's ready for tonight, I think you've been exactly on point. A bit about our speaker. Andy Moravcsik is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, and he is without a doubt one of the most influential scholars, American or otherwise, of European politics and the European Union in the last half century. He is also, I should add, one of the most eloquent voices out there for the European project. And in that regard, it's worth remembering that he is in keeping with official American policy, although he's probably had his own variations, of the period since the end of World War II, or certainly the coal and steel community. And as such, he diverges only from one post-war president, and we don't need to talk about that more. I should also add that he is also not only one of the most influential, and this doesn't always go together, but one of the most productive scholars of European politics, having written more than 125 scholarly articles and 4 books. And he is very much in the public arena and has written more than 150 opinion pieces in leading publications. Now, Andy, I got those numbers from your website, but it didn't look like you had updated them recently. So it could be way higher. So, if you want to get the right introduction next time, you'll just have to update. Anyway, the point of all those publications is that if you don't know where Andy stands on an issue, you're not trying. I should add that in addition to all that scholarly industry, Andy is the Europe Books editor of Foreign Affairs. And that is something that I admire tremendously, because not only does that require him to get through at least several books every quarter on any number of different European subjects or Europe-related subjects, but he has to do the impossible and write briefly about them. Now, at Princeton, Andy is the director of the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination, an institution that supports teaching, scholarship, and events on self-determination in a globalizing world. When I first saw that, I confess I thought that was named after the wealthy New York family that has done an extraordinary amount philanthropically, but I later found out that, in fact, it was the Fürstentum Liechtenstein, and that struck me as quite remarkable because it is the last absolute monarchy in Western Europe. So, cool. That's really remarkable. Good for you. Andy has been over the years affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institution, the Munich Security Conference, among many other institutions. And before coming to Princeton in 2004, he was a tenured professor at Harvard. His work has been supported by every conceivable blue chip institution. He has consulted with or worked for a number of different governments, and I think really impressively, as a doctoral advisor, he has trained a significant portion of his field. And at least according to the guest list I saw, there is one student of his who should be in the room. Mark Koplovich, are you here? I haven't met you yet. But he is coming here as a fellow in the spring, so I thought that was kind of an interesting pairing. Anyway, this record alone would be deeply impressive, but Andy lives in a household in which intellectual achievement is an Olympics event. And so it is worth noting that alongside his research on European integration and world politics, our speaker tonight is a renowned expert and widely published author on the subject of opera. He has written on classical music for the Financial Times, Opera Today, and other publications. But that you'll have to come back and hear about another time. Today, Andy will stick to his day job and discuss a topic that has been rapidly rising in importance. Right-wing populism has been on the rise across the West for years now, something I think all of us are acutely aware of. Populist leaders have influenced national policies from Austria to Italy, France, the UK, Spain, Hungary, Poland, and many other countries. And with their insistent xenophobia, explicit denunciation of liberalism, advocacy of national values, and searing attacks on transnational institutions, these parties have given the established political parties in their countries much to worry about, and that is true for the public at large. But what is uncertain, and what Andy will examine during his time at the Academy, is what the actual effects of right-wing populism and right-wing political parties is on foreign policy. So without any further ado, I am going to ask our speaker to come up and explain this to us and tell us why we shouldn't be quite, perhaps, as worried as we feel we are. So with that, Andy, the podium is yours, and you can also push it up to your own happy height.
I can't live up to that. So if you, before I start, I really want to thank Dan and the whole staff here and this whole institution. On behalf of myself and Marie and all the fellows, my fellow fellows, it is a wonderful place to be. It is really giving all of us a chance to focus on our work, but also encouraging us to go out and interact with Berlin and Germany. It's just a wonderful thing, and I'm very pleased to be here. Dan sort of gave the introduction to the talk, that populism is a big topic. It's an der Zeit, as you would say here. And it's very troubling. It's troubling because of its possible consequences for democracy. It's troubling because of its effect on political competition. It's troubling because of the policies on various vulnerable groups in society. It's troubling because of its corruption. There are many reasons why it's troubling. And many people, including some in this room and friends of mine in this room, have written quite brilliantly on that. And today I want to pose the question that Dan mentioned, which is what the concrete effect actually is on policy, and particularly on foreign policy. Why would I pose this question? I pose this question because it occurred to me that it ought to have an enormous effect on foreign policy. These parties ought to be really engaged in foreign policy. Why? Well, because their ideology and rhetoric is largely devoted to international topics and even specifically foreign policy. They acknowledge or possess ideological affinities with authoritarian regimes. The groups I'm talking about are mostly in democratic societies and mostly in Europe, but they still reach out to these authoritarian countries elsewhere. their number one concrete issue has to do with migration and the relationship between people in different society, transnational society. They're skeptical of international human rights and such. They're skeptical of international law and institutions. They're skeptical of the European Union. And all this is reflected, particularly in their rhetoric, particularly their identity discourse. So we ought to therefore see a very strong effect on foreign policy. And yet when you look around, you can see that that effect is, at the very least, uneven, as the case of Maloney now shows, somebody who barely has pursued a policy that's distinctively populist in her foreign policy, or right-wing in her foreign policy. And perhaps in other cases more troubling, but it's hardly clear that they actually are making good on what they say, or that they are biting as well as barking. So to research this, I'm going to pose three fairly straightforward questions, and in this relatively short talk, just sketch out some answers to them. So the three questions are, how much impact do these parties actually have? Can we estimate roughly whether they have a lot of impact or not? And in particular, among advanced industrial democracies, I'll focus in the talk mostly on Europe, but I'm happy to talk about Trump and other cases in the questions. Secondly, we will find that this impact, or I will assert that this impact, is relatively small and sporadic. So the question is, why? And under what cases might we see worrisome exceptions? And finally, if these parties, so extreme right populist parties, have little impact on foreign policy, then how do they manage the discord between their rhetoric and their reality? Why don't they get called to task for this? So let's just jump right in. How much impact do these parties have? Now, I'll be very quick about this, because the research is very detailed and exhaustive. So we look at 50 different foreign policy issues. We look at them in Western countries generally and try to see if there's any consensus. And then we look at a number of specific countries, notably Hungary, Germany, Italy, Austria, and the US, and we're still working on France, the UK, and Denmark, to see whether or not the policies are distinctively different, and if so, what the position of the right-wing party is with regard to that. And then we do rather close case studies in some of those cases. What we find is a surprising lack of influence of the far right, or a surprising lack of movement in the far right direction in many of these policies. And in those that do move in the direction that the far right would like, it's often difficult to show that they're responsible for that shift. There are a lot of tricky issues involved with dealing with this kind of question. The scholars in the room will know about selection bias and counterfactuals and all that kind of thing. So I'm going to just look at a small subset of the data concerning important issues, and a place where, if there is any effect of these parties on foreign policy, we should see it. So here we have a chart, and it's not as daunting as it seems. So we have a group of countries. These are the countries where the far right has been at some point in the last 10 or 15 years in government. And this is how much of the cabinet they controlled at the time, including parties that informally engaged with the government. And then we have a set of issues across the top, and we have a set of letters in the boxes. And the letters are the first one, whether the far right party took a position that was opposed to the consensus among Western societies. So in the case of NATO, pulling out of NATO. And the second one, whether the government accepted that position. So if it's green, any form of green, it means that the policy is essentially the consensus position in the West. And what you can see, which is even more true, because I've taken the difficult cases, even more true if we look at all 50 issues, is that the chart is largely green. So the first takeaway is not much changes across the board. If we have to look for an effect, it will be in very specific areas. Now, the other thing you see from this chart then is, okay, there's one row where there's some issues, exactly where you'd expect it to be, the UK. So that's basically Brexit there, where UK takes a heterodox position. Then there is an obvious issue, which is if the EU goes after some of these countries, Hungary and Poland, those countries respond with non-compliance. But most other countries back the EU position to a greater or lesser extent. And then we have two interesting issues: migrant quotas, or generally the treatment of migrants in country, to be distinguished from whether or not you let them in. But once they're in, how you treat them, which is what the discussion of migrant quotas and treatment of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants is about. And then an issue which is emerging, and there's an asterisk there because it's still a kind of symbolic issue. We're not sure if there is a common Western position across the board and what the challenge might be, but a potential issue on the horizon, which is climate change and the EU Green Deal. And you can see that a lot of the far-right parties are skeptical of that, but policy doesn't reflect that yet. So this is more or less what the data looks like. And I'm not going to talk about it in great detail. Happy to answer questions in the break. But notice that these are areas where we might expect that these parties would really concentrate their efforts. Right? I mean, the whole issue of NATO, Russian sanctions, and aid to Ukraine is something about which they talk a lot. Even though and disagree amongst themselves, you can see some parties are strongly opposed to assistance to Ukraine, but a surprising number actually are on board. Similarly, the EU is a lightning rod for these countries, parties in these countries, and so on down the line. So if it's true here, we might assume that it's true elsewhere. So I want you to accept that as a stipulation. We can talk about it and move on to the, for me, more interesting question, which is why? Why is there so little change? So if these parties have such a small and sporadic impact in foreign policy, why is it? And now I'm going to lay out a model, but it's a very, very simple model of politics, which is, here is the basic strategic dilemma that you face if you are a far-right leader. And that is that you don't have anything close to 50% of the population on your side. So you need to get moderates on your side in order to be powerful enough to affect policy. And there are three kinds of moderates that you need to reach out to and influence in order to be impactful. One is voters. So you need to be a big enough party so you're relevant. If you're like the Danish far-right party now with 3% of the vote, nobody's going to pay any attention to you. So you have to gain votes, and you can see parties trying to do that. Secondly, you need to attract moderate parties. Let's say you get a lot of votes, and you're a potential coalition partner, you need to work with other people in order to get into government and influence the content of that government. And then finally, and this is distinctive to foreign affairs, you need to negotiate whatever foreign policy actions you take with other countries. As we see from Brexit, nobody just does something unilaterally these days. They have to work out the consequences in negotiations with other people, and those people are unlikely to be as radically nationalist about your own country as you are. So you are going to have to placate those people somehow. And if we summarize my thesis in one sentence, it's that politics is hard, and these three things, starting from where these people start, is almost impossible to achieve. So that it's just very, very difficult to get stuff done. Now, to see why this is true, let's go through the three stages. So let's start with attracting votes. Okay, the problem there is that this political position is not so terribly popular. If you look at all the parties out there, then you can see that the median support for this kind of position, and I think most political scientists would think that nowadays that's kind of a natural thing, and it has been at certain past time as well, is around 15%. Some countries have almost no or no far-right party, and other countries have a lot more support for the far-right party. So in most cases, either within a broad party like the British conservatives or Fidesz in Hungary. You need to placate moderates. And more often, in the middle realm here, you need to form some kind of a coalition and get along with other people. But before you do that, you're trying to get lots of votes. Now, what do you need to get votes from people? You need a salient issue. Salience is political science for a very important and prominent issue that reaches out beyond your own party. So you are not going to be able to do this by having statues of Mussolini in your living room or something like that. You need to have an issue like climate change or an issue like migration or an issue like the Ukraine war that lots of people who are more moderate than your party agree with you on to be able to reach out toward the center of the political spectrum. And that's going to lead you to start to reach in a moderate direction. Now, before we go on, so this is the first hurdle, is how are you going to get enough votes as a party to be relevant? And it looks like most of these parties have trouble getting there. Before we go on, let me just say one other thing, which is the electoral system in which a party functions has a big effect on how much representation it gets for a certain number of votes. All electoral systems are biased, but some are more biased than others. And the ones that political scientists think are most biased are the majoritarian or first-past-the-post single-member district countries. And those countries are, I think, not by chance, at the top of this list. The UK, with its single-member districts. If the United States were on this list, it's also such a country. Hungary was always such a country, and Orban has changed the electoral system so it's even more of such a country. And you can see so are the Czech Republic, Italy, and Poland to a lesser degree. The result of this is that the voting power of the party that gets a plurality or a small majority gets expanded. So that these parties are there in the top, not just because these are particularly right-wing countries, although they may also be that, but because the electoral system allows it to happen. Okay, so that's number one. Now, just let me go back for a second. If you're in the middle of this list, you may be in and out of government, but you're pretty weak. Example, I was asked to tell stories, I'm going to tell stories. France. So how often have you read a story like this? The creeping normalization of the far-right Rassemblement National in northern France. And there's always, if it's a respectable journal, and Le Monde is, this kind of waffle sentence, okay? The 4 RN lawmakers elected in the right-wing region are attending fairs and ceremonies, winning over Romeros, and relying on their populist playbook in spite of their minimal influence. Whoops. Okay? And that's because when journalists write a story, they need to make it seem as if the world is being taken over by right-wingers. But if they're honest journalists, just honest enough to tell you that's not quite true. This is the position of Marine Le Pen in France, and it's almost without influence, right? I mean, you have 15% of the deputies in the Assemblée Nationale. That's something. It can make life a little difficult for Macron. No senators, no regional council presidents, no departmental council presidents. And here are the mayors, which the previous article was talking about, and they control 0.04, single digits of mayors in France. They have a few more MEPs, but actually also in that setting, not enough to have an influence. So lesson number one here, I guess, I hate to be somebody using the phrase fake news, but don't always trust the newspapers about the far right. Okay, challenge number 2. You've got your votes. Let's say you're one of those parties that gets to the top. You've got to get into government, or you've got to influence somebody who gets into government who thinks like you. And that's hard to do. That's another hurdle that cuts a lot of people out. So if you look at the right-hand column there, it's the percentage of the cabinet controlled by the far-right party at the present time. So you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 countries plus Sweden where there's this indirect influence where they're involved. That's leaving 22 where they are not involved. And the light green ones in that column are all the countries where anybody from the right has ever been in cabinet. So you're basically looking at half or a little more of the spectrum where these parties have never been represented. And so your probability of being an influential right-wing policymaker is small. And in the middle spectrum, so where Finland is now, being a minority partner in a coalition is a pretty crummy life. And the way to see that is to look at Austria, a country where the far right has been in government for almost half of the last 25 years. And when you ask and they've gotten a good vote. In fact, at one point, they had more votes in the first cabinet of Schüssel, more votes than the party, Schüssel's party, that actually headed the coalition. And yet, in each case, Austria went ahead, performed a successful European presidency, had a migration policy that was a little stricter, but so everybody's migration policy was moving in that direction at that time. There's nothing special about what happened. Because if you're a minority party, you're small. If you're far right, you're on the edge of the political spectrum, so you have no alternative. You have to make a deal with the party right next to you in the coalition, unlike somebody in the middle, like the Greens or the SPD here, which can make coalitions in different directions. And in many societies like Germany, there's a cordon sanitaire against coalition with such parties, and so they don't get into power at all. So it's a really tough environment in which to have any impact. Third challenge. Suppose you actually get into government in one form or another, single party like Orban, or a coalition like the Finns. Then, if you want to do anything radical, you've got to negotiate that with other governments. And as we see from the same chart we just saw, most of the other governments aren't far-right governments. That's almost always going to be true. So that's going to be a really tough negotiation, as the British found out when they tried to do something really different. You're always going to be outnumbered. So what does this depend on? It depends on your power. If you are a powerful country, I'm thinking of the United States here, maybe you can get away with just saying, we're going to do this unilaterally, and we don't really care what you think, and you're going to have to suck it up. Everybody else is going to have to think hard. And Orban, who is no fool, knows this. He thought hard about the British, which he admired for their courageous Brexit Act. But he said, Hungary's not an island, too closely integrated with the EU to follow Britain now. We can't afford to do that. It's reasonable for Hungary to be part of the European Union. And anyway, Hungarians have the highest level of support for the European Union of any country in Europe, along with the Poles. So that's just not going to happen. And Orban knows it's not going to happen. And this is generally an issue. So when we measure power in international relations in this kind of situation where you're not expecting people to invade one another, we think about how economically dependent they are on other people. And I just want to highlight one column of this chart, and that's the column here, which is how big a percentage of your GDP do your exports to somebody else comprise as compared to how big a percentage of their GDP their exports to you comprise. Because if you're going to cut off the relationship, you're both going to lose. Of course, if you're dealing with somebody much bigger, like Britain versus EU, the common trade, which is roughly similar size both ways, is going to be a much higher percentage of the British GDP than the EU GDP, and that puts them at a negotiating disadvantage. So the British are 5 times more dependent on the EU than vice versa, until you get down to Estonia, which if it decided to pull out of the EU would take a 530-time bigger hit than the EU would take from Estonia. Now notice that all these countries are relatively interdependent and relatively dependent on the EU. Nothing like the US, When the US decides to levy tariffs on China, which was reasonably complex thing, they are only 0.2% as dependent on China as China is on them. So this is the number where you think, okay, that sounds like kind of a reasonable thing to do. But unilateral action for countries like Hungary, as Orban just explained to us, and Slovenia and so on, is for almost every country, and this is, again, all the countries that have had far-right governments, not on. Okay, so let's turn to the final question. So we've established that this is not, most of what these groups promise, radical breaks with the international system, are not possible. And they know it's not possible. So the question is, how do they manage the tension when they're promising all these things but not delivering all these things? Now, a canny right-wing leader, again, put yourself in the position of the canny right-wing leader, thinks about this like this. And here's where you're going to start to understand what kind of parties these are and why they're different from other parties. He or she thinks, okay, I have in my coalition, or one way or another, my base, my radical base, and I have moderates. And what does the base care about? It cares about a bunch of really extreme policies, and it cares that you are representing them, that you are speaking their frustrations, that you are fighting their fight. Your moderates, middle class, better educated, business interests as well there, are thinking, I care about the policy. On a bad day, I'll hold my nose about the radical talk, but I want to make sure that we don't cut ourselves off from the world economy or something like that. There's nothing complex about this. It's exactly what historians say about the Weimar Republic, that it is the moderates who are in the driver's seat here. They decide whether or not the policy's going to go forward. They are the enablers of this far-right faction, and in exchange for that, they have to get policy. So how this works out, so what the leaders do then is give each part of the coalition what they want most. The radicals get talk, and the moderates get action. Now, exactly how this works out differs depending on how big your party is. So let's start with the AfD. The AfD thinks they're traditionally small, and in any case, even if we get big, we have no chance of getting into the government. So we can afford to be completely crazy, unproductive. We don't have to have a plan for anything. We can talk radical. Maybe we'll peel off a few votes from people who are cranky. In any case, being a German parliamentarian, being voted in by your base is a pretty good life, last I checked. So why shouldn't they? If you're a moderate-sized party and you think, I could really be part of political decision-making in my society, like Giorgia Meloni, then your incentive is exactly the opposite. You try to expand your vote share, expand your alliances, expand your feasible policies by becoming more moderate. And Meloni has done this to an incredible extent. So has Le Pen. So have lots of parties in Europe. How do you do it? There's a formula. First, you get rid of all the Nazi talk and the anti-Semitic talk, the stuff that really turns people off. Then you cultivate a certain amount of ambiguity about what your incentives are. Then you reverse policy, and parties that were previously in favor of a referendum to pull out of Europe no longer are. We're opposed to the euro, are. We're pro-Russian, become pro-Ukraine. This is where Meloni is now, and increasingly, with the exception of the Russian part, that's where Le Pen is too. But the reason is because the political logic dictates it. Both of them think, I could be part of the game. And what happens if you're Orban? You control the political system, you have locked it down. They do only what their international influence permits, which in the case of Hungary is almost nothing. But you bark louder than anybody else Because if you're Orban, I come from a Hungarian family, a Hungarian man, and you want to be seen as the man in control. So people are asking themselves in Budapest, why isn't Viktor, triumphing over these horrible liberal elites and George Soros and all that kind of thing? And so he needs a shtick, as we would say. He needs really good rhetoric. And the more we respond to that rhetoric by saying, look at how awful he is, look at what he's getting away with, the bigger he looks to his own people. It's a great game. And he performs it at a world-class level. What he and other right-wing leaders who are really good at is saying one thing and doing another in a convincing way. That is the governance strategy. And these guys are good at it. Now, I can finish by telling a few Orban stories because his willingness to do this is just extraordinary. So, example one, he dines with Putin regularly, not so much anymore since the war, but before he used to go 3 or 4 times a year, and dutifully voted for every Western sanctions package that came through. He loudly proclaimed that after the day the war started, that Western weapons could not transship Hungary to go to Ukraine. 5 days later, very quietly, he took the decision back, so quietly that reputable newspapers were still reporting 6 months later that he was blocking the weapons from going in. And he could tell his Hungarian compatriots that he was saving them from the destructive consequences of the war. Famously, he spent 90 million euros conducting a referendum on the migrant sharing plan that would have put 1,200 migrants in Hungary. Makes no sense if you're trying to maximize policy, but that's not the game. The game for him is to appear as if he is a strong guy. And one of the most important issues for him, and even more important for many other far-right governments, so important that the Belgian government coalition fell at one point. The Estonian guy resigned over this issue. What is this magical issue that's so important to them? It is the General Assembly resolution on the Global Compact on Migration. Probably there are 3 people in this room that really know what that is. The Global Compact on Migration is a non-binding, non-legal, aspirational document that the UN promulgated in a large conference about migration. But for Orban, it's gold. Because Orban can oppose this with no consequences. Nobody's going to go after him like cutting off trade or, democratic backsliding. And he held a whole discussion of it, referendum, all that kind of thing. So notice how people like Trump and Orban assume this role, the role of the strong man who is able to engage in this rhetoric, and almost without any attention to whether or not they're actually delivering something. And a certain part of the political spectrum buys that. Now, I know I haven't talked at all in this talk about the UK or about the United States. I'm happy to do that in questions and hear your views about it. But to conclude provocatively, because I don't think I've been provocative enough, the foreign policy problem in advanced industrial democracies today is not so much that they're being taken over from the far right. The problem is that they've failed to address satisfactorily certain problems, and I think there's some people in this room, Michael Zorn and others who believe this as well, problems that increasingly impact moderates. Problems like migration, problems like the cost of the energy transition, perhaps globalization aspects, geopolitical competition. Blaming Trump or Orban for not solving these problems or for what they do or for their rhetoric is not really going to solve the problems at all. It's not going to change anything. There are lots of reasons to worry about the far right in our societies, I think, but their effect on substantive foreign policy is not one of them. I look forward to your views. Thank you.
question number one, talk about Trump. Because he seems different. I'll elaborate. The rap on Trump was he was going to do a lot of those things. He was just inept. It wasn't pure rabble rousing. And, very close aides of his have said that he really will pull out of NATO in a second term, should he get the chance. Does he belong in this pack, or is he different?
So there's good news and bad news. Let's do the bad news first. The U.S. is, as I pointed out before, if you buy the kind of structural view about what kind of countries are inclined to be like this or be fertile territory for the far right, it's for very many reasons fertile ground. It's a very insular country. I mean, the level of GDP traded, exports plus imports, is minuscule compared to any other major industrialized country. It's extremely powerful, so it does or thinks it can do things unilaterally. The presidency itself is a very powerful office compared to being a German prime minister, so you can imagine Trump getting his way one way or another. Remember what a bad effect the majoritarian electoral system has. I mean, Trump, after all, got less votes than the person he ran against, but he was president, so he could get put in office even without a majority mandate. And I think it's fair to say the United States has a relatively, sometimes nationalist or sometimes just kind of leadership-oriented ideology that makes people think that it should do what it wants. So I think Trump achieved some things that one could argue are distinctive right-wing policies that would not have been achieved if he were not president the first time around. But relatively few, surprisingly few, I think, actually. He did things like leaving the Paris Agreement, but in the United States, that's just symbolic. He withdrew from the Iran deal, but every candidate on the Republican side plus the Senate had already said they were going to do that. He closed the borders, but that's bipartisan too. Afghanistan turned out to be bipartisan, but maybe he had some effect on that. More serious, I think, is the treatment of migrants in country, where just like his European brethren, his policy is distinctly different than the policy that Democrats would pursue. And the Chinese tariffs, where, yes, it turned out also to be a bipartisan policy, but it probably wouldn't have happened if Hillary Clinton had been elected. So you can argue that much of what Trump did was really the agenda of the center right, and domestically also. And I think that the reason he didn't do more stuff that he wanted to do, like pulling out of NATO, and this is based on really having gone through all the books about the blow-by-blows, is less, as people argue in many of those books, that he was inept and that he was opposed by bureaucrats who, pulled papers off his desk and then he would forget about it and stuff like that. That worked for a while. But by the last year of Trump's term in office, he had his own people in there. He understood these issues. That's why he was able to, for example, get the deal on Afghanistan done. And when he was blocked on NATO, he was not blocked because there were just bureaucratic obstruction. He was blocked because Congress came to him and said, we will roll you if you try to do this. So there was enough congressional support to keep it in the room. So I think we would need to go issue by issue and see what Trump actually could achieve in that circumstance. But I think those political constraints are larger than many people do. So I would be, slightly more optimistic than some people might be. But the takeaway of this kind of analysis is the United States is the weakest link. Of all the countries, we, the United States, is structurally set up to be able to do this way more easily than almost any other country. So good news and bad news.
Thanks for making my day. So I would only, add as a footnote, we don't have to debate it, is that the Congress of 2018 was not so much Donald Trump's Congress, but the Congress of 2022, particularly with the House in the shambolic state it's in, is a very different thing. And if Donald Trump didn't want to fund Ukraine, he could get away with it.
Ukraine would be a better bet, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Questions before I continue more? Yes, back here. Can you just wait for the microphone?
Another student of mine, by the way, Moravcsik, who teaches at LSE, but lives in Berlin. It's a wonderful thing about the modern
You
Europe.
know the way he thinks, so this is your big chance. Yeah.
I do, I believe. But thank you. So now I no longer have to introduce myself. And you said something towards the end when you were talking about the ambiguity in the rhetoric of these people, that a selectorate of the voters, of the electorate, will believe them, others won't. And this, for me, raises the question, so in political science term, what's your underlying model of the voter? So why do some voters love to believe whatever these radical parties are saying and others don't? Is this because they are just different cognitively or for other reasons? But this then raises the question why, despite all of this, these parties grew in the last couple of years or in the last decade. Or is it because these people are exposed to different media, to different channels? After all, one thing these parties have in common is an attack on mainstream media, and once they're in power, they actually try to capture mainstream media. So what do you think is actually making the difference here? Why do some believe the rhetoric and others don't?
So a good example of your last point is Orban, who really does control the media and so on. And fortunately, he's in a small country, so he's externally constrained anyway. Although, there are domestic constraints there too. I'm not a voting behavior or electoral politics or public opinion person, which are, for those of you who don't know, very specialized domains of political science. So I've tried to base this model on generally consensually accepted facts about the electorates concerned. And it is consensually accepted in the literature that those people who vote for the far right are less well informed on issues, more prone to protest voting. It might not be the only thing that they do, a major thing that they do, but Michael Zorn has argued that, as many people do nowadays, that globalization has led people to be, and economic distress has led people to be unhappy with their circumstances, and they then transpose that unhappiness to another issue. So they're not really focusing on what you can do for me on that issue. They're focusing on the emotional resonance of that issue. I just take that as given from the literature as something that more people believe than not. And it strikes me as very different from the calculation that's being made by a CDU guy who's concerned about the price of energy for some district in Baden-Württemberg where where the corporations or people in their nice homes are having trouble. And I think that's pretty uncontroversial. So I'm hoping to be able to slip through without answering your question.
See, wait for the mic. Is that you, Michael?
Yes.
It's bright here. So,
I'm Michael Doyle. I'm a fellow here at the American Academy. Andy, I think, is a wonderful story. And from what I hear, to me, completely convincing as a story about European populists. And you've already drawn some exceptions, that the U.S. is the potential dangerous outlier to this. My question is, to what extent does this, what I would see perhaps, and you'll respond to, European logic, translate to populisms, right-wing populisms, in other parts of the world that don't have the European structure? The stability of their electorate's a bit more volatile. They don't have the instantiation of democracy that is with even a Brussels twist to it. and they don't have to get the support of their neighbors to change policy because regional organizations tend to be very, very weak in other parts of the world. So my question is does this model translate to Latin America, South Asia, Africa, or East Asia? Thank you.
So that's a great question, and not one to which I'm in a position to give a richly data-based answer. But I have talked to a lot of people about it because I've thought about it. So the account that I give is dependent on having either relatively stable democratic institutions within which checks and balances still function, or, like in the case of Orban, a small enough country but interacting enough with the world so that that constraint clicks in. And there are cases where you ask yourself whether that's true. India, for example, is a striking example. And I have talked to people quite a bit about India, and I think the impression I've gotten from that is that domestically it's worse in some ways. I mean, sort of almost government-sanctioned violence against minorities and things like that at a scale that you wouldn't expect to see, even in Poland or something. But internationally, actually much more cautious and careful. I mean, you might have expected the Indians to make a big deal of the conflict with China, but they didn't. Quite the contrary, actually. Smiling together after a matter of weeks. You might expect them to pick a fight in Pakistan. No. The closest thing is Kashmir, but Kashmir is almost more like a domestic issue. Their beef isn't so much with Pakistan as it is with minorities within the territory that they already control. So I guess I would say there is good reason to believe that it might be more dangerous in that context, but I'm a bit surprised when I talk to people from most of those areas who are experts in most of those areas, that you don't seem to see it. Really aggressive, outrageous, substantive behavior, as opposed to the political posturing and the procedural stuff and everything that populists do. So, I guess you could be cautiously optimistic from that, or you could say, like political scientists do, we just need more research on this subject.
You didn't talk to Justin Trudeau today, did you?
No, I got the call, but it just didn't.
You saw the news.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, so Justin Trudeau accused of India of carrying out an assassination of a Sikh leader on Canadian territory. It's a little more provocative.
Right.
Okay, so we have something from the home audience. I'm going on the assumption that if he is in America as a former American Academy Fellow, we can say his name here without Datenschutz coming to kill us. Stephen Hill, American Academy Fellow, Spring 2016. Andy, your thesis is well argued, spot on. How does the EU voting formulas, i.e. unanimous votes, double majorities, give an opening to the Orbans of the EU to leverage their vote for more influence? Do you recommend that the EU change its voting formula to simple majority or some hybrid in some situations or all situations?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, it's true that Orban can take advantage of this, but I think you have to pick your poison there. You could put more pressure on Orban if you had a simple majority voting system, but you would also get more votes where countries got rolled. And it could potentially, it depends on what the issue is that you're changing the voting system, because it's obviously different by issue. But, insofar as there's any there in substantive reality to the concerns about the EU being this overweening superstate or something, it's going to be in areas that are of real concern to the far right, like, for instance, the climate change policy. So passing a climate change policy by simple majority that all of Eastern Europe couldn't accept would be as likely to create more populism as it would be than do anything else. So I'm actually rather a fan of the qualified majority voting arrangements in the EU. it's a kind of weird thing for a political scientist to say, because it's true that when you look at them formally, you just go, this political system could never work. I mean, how is it that you could have, 80%, 75% majorities required and still they make decisions? I think it's a testament to both the reasonableness and convergence of Europeans over time and the deep interdependence among them, that they actually manage most of the time to make reasonable decisions this way. And I think we would have to think very carefully about the benefits and costs of moving away from that successful model.
Professor Shapiro.
Thanks. Jeremy Shapiro from the... Oh, thank you. Jeremy Shapiro from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Andy, I was very compelled by your argument that Orban is a gifted gas bag. But I am still a bit worried, and I wonder if maybe you can sort of expand your model a little dynamically. It seems to me that you have described a situation in which populist parties, when they're at a sort of low voting threshold, I guess in the 10%, are quite vocal and nasty sounding because it doesn't have any impact. When they get into a place where they can imagine power, they moderate for the three reasons that you said. It would seem that you could extend that and say, well, actually, if those constraints reduce over time, either because they, as they often do, get more control of their domestic situation, which is the sort of Hungary and Turkey story, or internationally because more populists come into power elsewhere, Donald Trump is elected, or more populists get into power in European countries, in Italy, that they could then become more true to themselves, and that's in fact part of the process, that they are biding their time, that this is what fascists often do, is the way they sort of take out the democratic system from the inside, and that takes a while, but you do have to march some moderate paths to do it, but eventually you get there. One senses almost with the sort of new generation of far-right people in Europe that they've abandoned the idea of getting out of the European Union for all the reasons that you said, but another reason is that they actually think that actually now they can remake it in their own image because they have acquired enough support throughout the EU, they have enough people in power that internally reforming the EU so that, if you're expanding to Ukraine, instead of having a widening and a deepening, you can have a widening and a shallowing. And get rid of a lot of these rule of law constraints. So I guess my question is, what does your model tell us about what's going to happen in the next phase?
So if the model says that up to now, and we now have 30 years of history with these parties, in some countries having been there for half the time, right? We see what appear to be kind of natural limits on how much impact they can have, and where they do have the power to actually lock down the whole political system, which requires bending the democratic rules and so on. It has not happened in a country like Germany, where that would be a consequential thing for the world as a whole. So I think it's fair to, and many of the most, by and large, on the big issues, many of the most important parties have moved way more moderate than they used to be. So if anything, the trend of rhetoric has gone in a moderate direction. I mean, these parties are considerably more moderate on Russia. They're considerably, as a whole, there's difference among them, as you saw from the charts, but considerably more moderate on Russia, considerably more moderate on Europe, considerably more moderate on NATO, all this stuff. And so you would need something of the force to completely reverse the trend of the last 25 or 30 years. Now, there's plenty of things you can imagine. I mean, if the world economy goes into a Great Depression, so we're sort of reliving 1929, sure. If the, I don't know what, climate change comes upon us quicker than we thought and everybody's cast out of their homes.
A populist is elected in the United States.
Sorry?
A populist is elected in the United States.
A populist has been elected in the United States for 4 years. and what it did was, from the point of view you're talking about, individual beliefs, it turned people less pro-American, as it always does when Republicans go into power, and particularly when somebody like Trump goes into power. The Europeans actually stood up there and fought back. And it's interesting, Trump, this is a canny individual. So, for example, take trade. Yeah, Trump picked on the Europeans and he picked on the Chinese. But the value of the tariffs leveled on the Chinese was 30 times the size of the tariffs leveled on Europe. Why? Because Europe could retaliate. And somebody like him didn't want that. So these basic facts of power, particularly the power of Europe as a whole, are something that insulate you to a certain extent against some of these scenarios. So I think the kind of scenarios that would lead to your kind of world where things get so much worse that we're now living in a world that looks like Europe in 1939, where you have 5 democracies and everybody else is fascist, is such a large change from the trend we are now experiencing that all bets would be off. So I don't claim to be able to have a crystal ball. I'm extrapolating the past, but it would have to be something monumental. And that makes me relatively sanguine.
Holly. We'll come back over here, I promise.
Thanks so much.
My colleague, Holly.
Yeah, I'm Holly Case. I teach at Brown University, and we have breakfast almost every day together.
So you know how he thinks. Yeah.
And one question. A lot of the things that you said about populists of today would have applied to Putin until 2014 or until 2022. And in 2014, what he did was define Crimea as a domestic issue, and a lot of people believed him. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, what is foreign policy actually, and is it a moving target, especially with matters like migration, which has this domestic and foreign policy matter, climate change, which is, it's hard to say how much of that is foreign policy and how much of it is domestic. My other question is, is this sort of an insight of a more general sort that we should absorb and, in terms of, okay, this is the way things are? Or is there a politics that you presume to being sanguine versus being nervous? Is there some advantage to not, political positive that comes from not being nervous or that, because I think the counter argument is that being nervous keeps you on your guard, and that's why, when you're looking at the press, you think it's good not to be sanguine, but are there political reasons in your view to be not worried?
Yeah, I do think there are political reasons to be less worried. One reason is that talking about them obsessively builds them up. So this is how Trump got to be who he is, right? I mean, he's on CNN every night for 3 hours. And even in the liberal community, he looks larger than life. Orban sets these situations up deliberately so that the conspirators that he hates, the Soros and the, various religions, and the horrible stuff that he spouts, but the people he portrays as enemies will go after him because it shows everybody in his domestic policy that he really is this important threat, which if you just looked at it objectively, you'd say, So I do think that there is a sense in which and there's one other thing too, which is if we looked at this as issue-driven, we'd be a little less concerned about the fact, for example, that having a politically sustainable migration policy in a country like this or in the United States, we little less like that's an issue of the far right versus other people, and more of an issue that has to be solved because, in fact, it's a broad public concern. So remember that my argument before was that the far right spouts rhetoric, but it also picks a few issues which can cross over into the middle of the political spectrum. And one of those issues clearly is uncontrolled migration. I mean, if you look at the polls numbers on uncontrolled migration in most Western societies, it's a massive majority against it. People are not anti-immigrant per se. They're not anti-refugee per se, but they're against masses of uncontrolled migrants. And that is a suicidal situation for moderate parties to get themselves into. But they can't deal with it because the issue has been polarized in this way. So I do think the talk leads us to kind of view it as an ideological battle when maybe we shouldn't always be doing that. Just quickly on your first point, I think the situation with regard and the trajectory over time and the ability to control discourse in societies like Russia is really very different than it is in European and Western democracies more generally. So I don't presume to generalize this to Putin. I think the dynamics there are different. I mean, authoritarian systems are more complicated than we think, and there are checks and balances, but I think that there are fewer immediate constraints. And if somebody goes off the reservation like Putin and just says, well, I don't really care about the wealth of the country in the short term, or I don't, I'm going to pursue this goal, there's less to stop him. So I'm more confident in what the possible futures are in a place like Italy than I am in a place like Russia. And I think with good social scientific reason.
Right there in the middle.
Stefan.
No.
I think
Michelle.
No, Stefan, go ahead.
Sorry. I didn't see you, Mika.
I'm Stefan Richter with The Globalist. As to the dynamic question, I think your model may be very self-stabilizing if you allow for the effect that the positions of what used to be hard right, at least in a number of social democratic countries in Europe, mostly in Scandinavia, have slipped into the mainstream positions. And I think you see this beyond migration also on the Green Deal issue, which you will see in Germany also, where the unions and so on have more concerns than the Greens. So the question is, don't you need to allow for that? I mean, your thesis will stand in my theory, because the extreme right-wing parties, to the extent that their positions are legitimate, as you just described on migration, are going to become part of the mainstream discourse. Germany probably going to be the last country on that. But in the rest of Europe, it's happening. And therefore, the other question is, in that sense, they are not unsuccessful by shifting the parameters of the mainstream parties. Have you thought about that,
yes.
Built that into,
So
how would you do that?
When we code countries, this is a great question. So when we code countries, we don't just say, did the country move in the direction that the far right wanted it to move? We then, this is why we do these case studies of how everything happened in the countries. We ask, why did it move in that direction? And what you tend to find, particularly with issues like migration and climate change, is that the issue moves not because the far right wants it to move, but because the costs of the policy being pursued get broad enough that all of a sudden centrists are implicated. So all you have to do is turn on the TV, as I've been doing for my 2 weeks in Berlin, and watching politics shows. You're watching your typical CDU guy get up there and kind of say, well, the industry is having some problems. Blah, blah, blah. But those concerns are real. I mean, you can measure them, you can see them in public opinion and so on. So I don't think we can just assume that the equilibrium in politics is what we saw in this exceptional moment for the last few years when we had the wind at our sails about climate change and the Ukraine thing pushing the energy venda and energy venda and all that. And I think those issues are very distinct from things like NATO membership, where you don't have that broad centrist disillusion with policy. So yes, you very much have to make. That's when I just as a throwaway said, there's a lot of tricky counterfactual issues and so on here. That's one of them. It's harder research to do than it seems.
So why is Orban holding up Swedish membership? Is that just another case of symbolic politics? What's the utility? I don't get it.
No, that's trying to do a deal to get himself off the hook on. I mean, the conventional interpretation of it, I don't
creating chits.
Yeah, it's just he creates chits and tries to figure because
he's learning from Erdogan.
Yeah, I mean he's somebody who's really punching above his weight in a way, because he's got this lock on the country. And he's achieved that in two ways. One is by being undemocratic at home and really controlling levers like the press and so on. And the other way is by being just ruthlessly transactional and constantly trying to figure out how to get chits so that he can cash them in. And he doesn't have any intrinsic reason whatsoever to care about Sweden being a member of NATO or not. None. I mean, I couldn't imagine what it would be.
Thank you. Michael Zürn, my name, Berlin Social Science Center. And I want to follow up the question of my namesake, Michael Doyle. I mean, I like this model, and I think it's a very, very convincing one in order to explain difference, variation within the European Union that you developed. And you also explained why there's one or two or three red countries that have changed their foreign policy with the same model, right? And that's the very, very convincing part. But the question is a bit, are all those other authoritarian populist leaders in the world not very close to UK and the US in the sense of your two major explanatory points? The one is that they have a majoritarian presidential system. I mean, all the Latin American ones, Modi, Putin was mentioned, and all of them are not dependent on the EU money and on the flow of EU money. So would your model not actually predict that all those guys do have a very strong effect on the foreign policy?
Yeah, I'm surprised that India is so well behaved as it is, I think. I don't think we should overestimate, particularly when you talk about Latin American countries and so on, how much de facto independence some of these places have without really destroying their own infrastructure. But yeah, I think we should see more deviation there, and I think in some ways we do. But like I said, I haven't really looked closely policy by policy at what Brazil does or what Venezuela does, and so I can't answer your question. But yes, I think there's some reason to be less sanguine about them than others. That being said, I have a certain amount of trust in the, particularly when we get away from resource-based economies, which political scientists famously think are unreliable because the resources, the rents in the society are so easy to capture by the leader. But if you look at a place like China, where Anne-Marie and I lived some years ago, when the government was very different. But one thing you noticed about it was that it is a society that is very invested in a particular development trajectory. And I would need to be convinced that anybody in China who's likely to be leader would just get up one day and say, I want to engage in the kind of military adventure that Putin did. It's not an entirely democratic society, but it's an interestingly, at least that was my impression at the time, interestingly representative society in a way that Russia perhaps is not. Russia seems more like a criminal gang. So now I've really done it. I said that on the feed, so I hope to sleep well tonight.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks a lot. That'll help us a lot here with our security.
So I do think there's still constraint there. But I'd love to see that research because I'd be curious what people would find.
So, returning to the home audience, one of your former editors, Gideon Rose, writes, Andy, fabulous stuff. I want you to make one specific prediction, assuming the war in Ukraine is still undecided a year from now. Well, Gideon is assuming that, anyway, how much will Trump change U.S. policy if elected?
This reminds me of a story that I'm going to tell because Gideon Rose would love it because he knows this person. There was a very, very famous political philosopher at Harvard, a legendary woman named Judith Shklar, who had survived the Holocaust and came from, I forget, Latvia, I think, and moved to Harvard and worked her way up in a time when women weren't professors, and she was famously tough. And there was something called the lunch that every junior faculty member was subjected to, where she called you to lunch and then she grilled you about your work. And so I told her, well, I'm working on the EU and I'm kind of interested in what's going to happen. And she looked at me and she said, don't try to predict the future. It always costs people tenure. So I'm ducking that question. I mean, but I have said previously here, I think that's a more worrisome prospect than anything I see going on in Europe, including Brexit, including the trajectory of Britain right now, which is in the right direction if starting from a bad place.
More questions? There was another one over here. There we go.
My seat neighbor had already.
Do you want the
asked
mic?
a version of the-
Oh, then you don't need the mic.
I have many questions.
Oh, well.
I'm Emily Schulteis. I'm a journalist who covers populist parties in the far right here in Europe, based in Berlin. I have a question. So my question was going to be about direct versus indirect influence, and you've already spoken a bit to that. But I guess my second question would be, oftentimes it feels like politicians, whether it's Orban or whether it's the Austrian FPÖ or perhaps even Giorgia Meloni, that the EU level is a convenient scapegoat rhetoric-wise, but oftentimes the policies that they are, sort of the main policy priorities that they are looking to pursue, either themselves in government or by influencing other political parties toward their positions, are on the domestic level. And so I guess I'm curious how you would think about the interplay between those two things and the extent to which it's, in some cases, a foil either for domestic policies or for domestic corruption in certain cases or things like that.
I think you're absolutely right. The issues they care about most are domestic, starting with staying in power or being in power, but not necessarily because, sort of in power like the AfD. But insofar as they have things that they might genuinely care about because they have some element in their base that really cares about this, they tend to be more domestic things. Exception migration, again, which spans the two, and it's the one issue where you really can say from beginning to end, the far right has had this one issue that people in the party really care about and propels them forward. But things like treatment of women and minorities, the role, if you look at some Eastern European countries, Romania, for example, of role of religion, same in Spain. Meloni took the interesting step of essentially manufacturing an issue. She was so moderate that you need something to make her look like she's real, and she picked something that's particularly cruel but not Hitlerian in its breadth, which is to pick on foreign surrogacy, so gay people who hire women in Ukraine or wherever to have kids. And this seems particularly cruel and narrow thing, but it also kind of looks like somebody trying to come up with an issue that they can always point to and profile them as being a certain way. I think Meloni is extraordinary because she's even given up on the beating up on Europe side of it. Yes, and if you read the Italian stuff as opposed to the English language stuff, she does occasionally take a whack, but she's there with Ursula von der Leyen, in Tunisia, and I think she's figured out. Because think about her political calculation, just now get really micro with Italy. The person whom she wants to, I won't say stick a knife into, the person she would like to diminish their impact in Italy is Salvini, is her alliance partner, right? She got where she is because she tacked to the moderate side of Salvini, and she was the trusted person, and give him a good shove. And he's stuck where he is because he's been in Italian politics forever as this kind of slightly boorish guy paid for by the Russians, and all that stuff that people worry about with the far right. And so she comes in and she's established this position, and it's worked so well for her that why would she blow it now by taking a whack at Europe? So I think she's sort of reconstituting herself not so much as Salvini but as Berlusconi, or even to the right of that, to the left of that. So I guess I don't worry about it as much.
So I'm going to ask a practical question, a bit of advice from you to the Biden administration. Would you, everyone was excited when the Summit of Democracies was first put together, that this was the moment that Hungary and Poland would be really read the Riot Act and so on and so forth. Ukraine came along, the desire for an alliance in the Far East that was not exactly democratically based came along. Would your advice be let that whole effort quietly pass by and let's not revive it?
Yes, but not because I've thought about it deeply, but because my wife is an expert on this issue and has taken that view. I mean, I think there are lots of things to worry about.
You can speak for yourself if you want.
There's lots of things to worry about in the modern world, being too white and black about who your allies are. It's a world of the second and third best, and this is a case where, as Anne-Marie often points out, it's very difficult to tell who is democratic and who's not. You often have people who you want to have on your side, like Singapore, who are not democratic. I mean, there's so many problems. And I think we are a ways from being there. Inside the EU, I think it's a little bit different. I'm less, I'm aware that there's a trade-off between getting Orban's help on some things, perhaps, and how much you squeeze him. But I don't have any problem with squeezing him within Europe as long as it's not coming at the cost of something extreme. And that requires that the institutional setting be right. So for a long time, I don't think it was, and you didn't want to risk alienating because you're trying to do things like, save the euro. So you pick your poison. But now I think they grabbed the opportunity, and Ursula von der Leyen was right to grab the opportunity when it came, and you should squeeze them some because it's unacceptable behavior. But it's domestic behavior that's unacceptable. It's the Hungarians that are paying the price.
This is a household unified position we have here.
An unusual one. I'm delighted to see marital influence extend so far.
Well,
and I must say it's however, not a unified position in my family, because I come from a Hungarian family. I still have relatives back in Hungary, and the ones who stayed are people who, last I checked, were very happy with Orban, as some Hungarians are.
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of the advice of a wise Mandarin at the State Department to one of the youthful diplomats. Don't just do anything, stand there. So on that note, I want to thank you for a terrific talk, Andy, and you've given us a lot to chew over, and maybe we'll just take 15 minutes out of Anne-Marie's talk to come back to this when the time comes. And in the meantime, I just wanted to say fall semester is now in full swing, and I want to close by inviting you to our next few events. On Thursday, our Nina Maria Gorison Fellow, Mariana Candido, will speak about women in Angola, 1500 to 1880, and why the experience of women in West Central Africa during the period of the slave trade goes well beyond that of queens and captives. Next week, we will do one of our seldom but very important online-only events on the legal travails of Donald J. Trump. I'll be joined by Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic and Academy trustee, and Ryan Goodman from the NYU School of Law, and that will take place one day before the second Republican debate that the same Donald J. Trump will be skipping. So that is on Tuesday, the 26th at 6 p.m. On Thursday, the 28th, Holly Case, to my left, will be tracing tainted ideas throughout history in her Axel Springer lecture at 7:30. And now I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'd like you to give a round of applause to our very learned speaker.